radio for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network and KGRA, the Global Radio Alliance.
I need your help to get to the year 1985.
You are listening to Fade to Black with Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network.
Yeah, man. How you doing? How you doing? Yeah, man, it's Fade to Black. Bespoke radio for the masses. Today is Monday, August 19th, 230 days into the new year, just 135 days left. We are live from a bunker somewhere in the middle of beautiful downtown Burbank, California. I would like to welcome everybody listening from all around the world, all across the United States, hither and thither, to and fro, back and forth, up and down, east and west, north and south, far and near. This is Fade to Black for KJCR, the Game Changer Network, and KGRA, The Planet. I am your host, Jimmy Church. What is cracking, everybody? How you doing? Yeah. I feel great. More on that in just a minute, because tonight we have very special guests with us right here. Laird Scranton. Now, he is here to talk some lost history. Gobekli Tepe, Egypt, and Velikovsky. That's what we're going to do. I cannot wait. Oh, what a way to come back off of a vacation. Stay with me. I'll be right back after this short break with tonight's guest, Laird Scranton. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, Laird Scranton is with us. Tomorrow night, Freddie Silva. Wednesday night, Francisco Osa, life coach. Thursday night is the film Extraordinary The Seating with director Joe Sumple and writer Jack Roth. Tonight, it is Laird Scranton. He's an independent software designer who became interested in the Dogon mythology and symbolism in the early 1990s. He has studied ancient myth, language, and cosmology since 1997 and has been a lecturer at Colgate University. His work includes articles published in the University of Chicago's Anthropology News Academic Journal, in Temple University's Encyclopedia of African Religion, and in the Vassar Quarterly Magazine. His book, The Science of the Dogon, was taught at Colgate University, but it was under the title Hidden Meanings, a study of the founding symbols of civilization. Laird has been interviewed on a variety of radio programs around the world, including Coast to Coast AM and Fade to Black, and is a featured speaker on ancient mysteries. He also appears in John Anthony West's The Magical Egypt DVD series. Tonight, we're going to do it all. We're going to discuss lost history, Gobekli Tepe, the Great Pyramid, and Velikovsky. That's right. We're going to tie it all together. And we've got Intertradition's website link up for Laird at jimmychurchradio.com, where you can go and check out all of his books. I would like to welcome back to Fade to Black, Laird Scranton. Laird, good evening, man. How are you?
Hey, Jimmy, I'm good. I'm so glad to see you back enough in the pink to be on doing interviews again. That's great.
Man, it was rough, man. It was rough. It was rough. But, we get through it. The show must go on, and they ain't going to take this guy down. So it's really that simple. It's that simple. Laird, welcome back to the show. It's always great to hear your voice. And we have so much to discuss tonight. But I kind of want to start here. When it comes to lost history, and all of your research and your books, there's, we can deduce. But the one thing that is like prevalent over all of it is that somebody somewhere wants to suppress information. Our past, our history is being kept from us, isn't it? And I have to ask you, why? Why is this going on?
Well, you can certainly point to a lot of situations that make it look like somebody is deliberately trying to hide certain things about different eras. I just came across one case recently in an ancient site in Syria, where the site was only available to archaeologists for a period of about a decade or so before it was covered over with reservoir water from the building of a dam. Same thing happened in the south of Egypt. They just got started exploring things in Nubia, and suddenly a dam was erected, and the entire region was covered over with water. It looks awfully suspicious in some circumstances that somebody's trying to cover things up. Your guess is as good as mine. The obvious inference is that there are things here that somebody doesn't want the modern populace to learn about.
And it seems to me it's just about every civilization, every culture, everywhere has their story of a suppressed past, where the history books and schools, they don't want, that everything started at 3000 BC, move along, there's nothing else to discuss here. And clearly that is not the case. And more evidence is coming forward every single day, pointing to intelligent civilizations that predated everything, but they don't want you to know about it.
Well, also the evidence becomes really a lot trickier if you're before 3000 BC, when you have written texts appear. It's much more difficult to make an argument if you don't have a written text to support what you're trying to say. So some of it may be legitimate, but the traditional viewpoint of academics is a lot more conservative than what the evidence points to.
Well, then we can start with Gobekli Tepe. Oh, and by the way, the Fadernauts here, this audience, they started a drinking game like 5 years ago when I started speaking about Gobekli Tepe. And so now every time I say, or you say, Gobekli Tepe, they drink. So I'm guessing in the next 20 minutes, we're going to lose half of our audience.
You're telling me that every time I say Gobekli Tepe, they're going to drink.
Gobekli Tepe.
We'll see how many different ways we can work that into a sentence.
I know, right? I think even GT doesn't work anymore either. That passes. So, but okay. The significance of Gobekli Tepe touches upon the 2 or 3 points that you just made. And the first thing that I'm going to bring up is written text. Clearly, on those pillars are symbols and messages left for us. And that wasn't supposed to exist, let alone at 7,000 years predating the Giza Plateau or ancient Sumer, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, that was one of the key arguments against John Anthony West and Robert Schoch's Sphinx argument, the argument that the Sphinx was older than traditionally thought. They said, well, how can it be? We have no evidence of a culture that is older than Egypt. But Gobekli Tepe is far older.
Can you imagine going back to 1992 when all of that went down in San Diego? That if Schoch was able to, at that press conference, go, well, surprise news, Gobekli Tepe, right?
Yeah, that's right. That would have been great. Well, as it is now, Gobekli Tepe is so substantiated that nobody can really question that it represents things that are far outside of the traditional paradigm that has been put forward for ancient Egypt.
Now, I want everybody in this audience to understand what we are saying here, okay? It's very simple. 3000 BC, in any textbook, in any course, in anything about world history, was the start of everything. Now we have something that is 7,000, not 700, not even 70 years, right? Which would be pretty cool too. 7,000 years before Giza, before Mesopotamia, before ancient Sumer, 7,000 years prior to that, we have a megalithic site with writing, symbolism, 3D art preserved, obviously organized, a civilization that knew how to quarry, knew about art, knew about engineering, knew about agriculture, had organization, and was a high-tech civilization that wasn't supposed to be there. That's exactly what Gobekli Tepe gives us, isn't it?
It certainly gives us a toehold into all of those things. We have a cluster of civilizing skills that all appear in the same place at the same moment. As you say, metallurgy, agriculture, stonemasonry, animal husbandry, the beginnings of what looks like might be proto-writing. You have all sorts of things happening, weaving and pottery, all these things within a very short span of time in the same region make their first appearance as far as any evidence we have goes.
Now, just saying that says it should be, according to academia and the media, one of the most important sites, if not the most important site on this planet to date, but nobody's talking about it.
Right. There isn't an awful lot of discussion academically about it. I think that with the death of the lead archaeologist there, that things have slowed down a little bit in terms of the excavations they've been doing. But there's an awful lot of potential for tracing the roots of other cultures from that region outward. As a matter of fact, that's what part of my research is focused on these days, is tracing how things went forward from that era.
Now, there's religion could be there. We don't know the purpose of the site, and we will certainly discuss that. But the other part of it, for me, which I think is the most significant, is it represents something celestial. It looks like there is. It depends on how you certainly want to interpret it. But there is representations of our seasons, and could possibly be things that weren't talked about. I want to say this without sounding too wingnutish, but would suggest how do I want to say? It would suggest knowledge of the heavens and transitions in the heavens that weren't talked about for another 8,000, 9,000 years, and not until Dendera. So if that is indeed the case, and represented the same way, which means they're looking up and seeing Taurus or Cygnus or whatever, represented in the correct way that would be picked up by other civilizations, but another 8,000 years later. And you have to stop and ask yourself, where does this knowledge come from at 10,000 BC, 11,000 BC?
That's right. And there are any number of theories right now about what was really going on at Gobekli Tepe. What's clear is it wasn't a city and it wasn't a fortification. So that pretty much leaves that it was a sanctuary that people went to for some specific purpose. To me, it looks like those were educational purposes. We have skills that the Buddhists and the Africans and others are talking about, having been instructed humanity in ancient times, all appearing in that spot. And you certainly have a site where it looks like people made pilgrimages to. That would certainly be consistent with what later cultures were doing. You have theories that say that the carvings on the pillars represent astronomical events that were happening in the sky. There are people who represent that there were alignments to specific constellations and specific risings and settings of stars and so forth. A lot of it is very difficult to prove because, as I said, we don't have written texts to tell us what the people at that time felt that these things represented, and so we're left to sort of guesswork sometimes about what must have been true.
And we picture, this is what is amazing to me, is that academia will paint a picture that at 3000 BC, at 3000 BC, we transitioned from Stone Age man into the Bronze Age. That was the magical time, right? And then slowly metallurgy came in, but before 3000 BC, man was out foraging for seeds in the desert, walking around with a club in his hand, and that's seriously what they want us to picture in our mind's eye. And then Gobekli Tepe shows us that we had things like fashion. We had belts and belt buckles and clothing and were able to carve in 3D relief. 3D relief. Now, clearly that's not Stone Age man. That's a culture that was technically advanced, and nobody wants to step forward and talk about this.
Right, and the crazy part is that we have the evidence of these carvings that predate the first evidence we have of tools that were capable of producing the carvings. So
exactly,
no kind of a theory as to how this came about.
And now, okay, staying on this, in order for, and we don't even know how much is there. All right, we've only got 10 to 25% of the site excavated right now. That it could be far older and more complex. The archaeology's got to be completed there. We're a long ways from that. But the fundamentals are here. I will argue with anybody when you have to have the organization and the knowledge of how to quarry these stones, transport them here, and then build the site. Forget about everything else. Forget about feeding. Forget about the astrology, the astronomy part, the cosmology part. Leave all of that out. Leave the artistic stuff out. Leave all. There were no weapons. There were no arrows. There was nothing military or defensive or offensive about the site. Leave all of that out too, Laird.
That's right.
Let's just talk about quarrying these stones and how Stone Age man went, I got an idea, right? Let's talk about that. It's an amazing, technically advanced site on that principle alone, isn't it?
Well, that's true because there's so much that goes into trying to extract stone from the stone bed that it's in. Then, if you take a very large piece of stone, how do you move it? How do you slide it? How do you transport it? Why would you think to do that? How far did you have to move that? How many miles did you have to try to move this? Were you moving it uphill? Then, in terms of the technology it takes to try to erect it in a way where the stone doesn't fall over and kill you, let alone, do you carve it before you put it up? Do you carve it after you put it up? Who even has any stone carving skills to work with? It's a very, very, very interesting site. There's an awful lot going on there that nobody understands yet.
Now, let's talk about, before we get to the break, and we'll continue the conversation after, but let's talk about who built it. In that, at 7,000 years predating Giza, so let's just pull some round numbers, 10,000 BC. It could be 10,500, it could be 11,000. Right. But we're at the edge of the last ice age, no matter where we date it. There's that aspect of it. You would normally kind of deduce, I said that twice in a show, I won't do it again, but that maybe this came from the south and moved north, right? Because of Mesopotamia, because of ancient Egypt and those cultures there. But we're talking about on the Armenian highlands, which is now present-day Turkey. Right. And it wasn't the Turks that built Gobekli Tepe, right? It was the ancient Armenian people. And did this come from a culture from the north that came down to the south? Who built Gobekli Tepe?
Right. Well, again, we have various theories from various researchers who all are looking at it from their own perspective. I think the old saying is that if you consult a brain surgeon, you're going to get a surgical solution proposed to whatever your problem is. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with researchers in this field. Is whatever their perspective happens to be, if their area of focus is east of there, they're going to find a way to see it that reflects Eastern influences. So you have all these competing theories as to who the people were. Part of the problem is that far back you don't have typically find surviving DNA that you can test to figure out where did the people come from. This is pre-pottery, so you can't check styles of pottery to say where did they come from. If a thing wasn't made out of stone, it didn't survive. So I suppose you could compare stonemasonry styles, except this is the earliest example of stonemasonry we have. So there's nothing to compare to. So it's a very, very difficult situation in terms of trying to prove in any absolute way who the people were, or where they came from, or why they were there.
Well, if you were a betting man, and I know you've analyzed this from every side. Wow, that was a weird sound. Was that you? No,
not on my end.
Wow. That was kind of cool. Right at the that was an important question. If you were a betting man, wow, I guess it was Godzilla. if you were a betting man, what do you think? Do you think Siberia? Are you going there? Are you going from the west?
I'd say all of the regions around that area were influenced by what happened there. It looks to me, based on studies of DNA, studies of civilizing skills, studies of agricultural cultivated plants that were moved outward from there, domesticated animals that moved outward from there, tools and things like that. It looks like it originated there and radiated outward in all directions from that southeastern Turkey originating point. This is Fertile Crescent stuff. It extends south and eastward through India, down east and south as far as Australia.
Right.
It extends down through Palestine into Egypt and then into northern Africa. This is Breasted's concept of the Fertile Crescent. He was tracing all of those aspects of civilization and mapped out this area that looks like a crescent. That's why it's called the Fertile Crescent. But we don't have any clear picture of any of this having radiated inward from the outer regions.
So you're suggesting it was the Kardashians?
Yes, I guess so. No, I mean there are perspectives that say that. John Anthony West was one of the people who entertained the idea that survivors of a prior civilization decided that was the place to try to reestablish civilizing skills for humanity. The name Gobekli Tepe, and I'm going to give everybody a chance to take a drink here. The name Gobekli Tepe, one of the interpretations of it is that it means central hill. Translation is difficult because back in the day of Gobekli Tepe, every word had a cluster of meanings associated with it. But central hill is also the translation of the Greek word opolis, and all of the Greek temples were situated on hills that were central. So that perspective makes it look as if this was deliberate, that the site was picked because it was central to so many different regions, and that the radiating of these skills outward was part of the plan, not accidental.
Next October, nearly a year from now, we'll be heading to Gobekli Tepe in Armenia. We are shooting a documentary and a series.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and I have talked about Gobekli Tepe so much that I don't know how I'm going to be affected by it when I finally reach the site. It'll kind of like be the first time I saw Van Halen. Right? I mean, I lost it. I just lost it. And we're so excited about that because this information, and it's not just Gobekli Tepe, but the Armenian highlands from Gobekli Tepe all the way east through Armenia, and Mount Ararat and the surrounding, the megalithic sites in Karahunj. It goes on and on and on. And its influence from the Armenian highlands, just like you just said, radiating out throughout the world. These sites and their importance are something that just isn't discussed. I remember talking to Graham Hancock about this, Laird, and I said, it seems to me that Gobekli Tepe and Karahunj are like the redheaded stepchilds, right? And he goes, you're exactly right, Jimmy. I don't understand. Karahunj is one of the most important sites on this planet, predating Stonehenge. And Karahunj means Stonehenge in Armenian, by the way. It is one of the most incredible sites with these pillars aligning to stars with holes in them, something that Stonehenge doesn't have. But,
right.
But nobody talks about it.
Right, because in the ancient Egypt, when you had a stone like that with a hole in it, we know for certain they were using it to cite alignments, or risings and settings of stars on certain dates and so forth. So it's very likely that any megalithic stone that they find with a what looks like a deliberately carved hole in the center of it is going to be used for alignment. And
we also have that at Gobekli Tepe, which let's take our break here. We'll continue with Gobekli Tepe, and we're going to talk some Egypt. And, of course, I'm going to get some Velikovsky and tie all of this together tonight. Our guest is Laird Scranton. It's Lost History on Fade to Black. My favorite thing, Laird. It's my favorite thing. More with Laird right after this short break. This is Fade to Black on the Game Changer Network and KGRA, The Planet. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, Laird Scranton is with us. We're talking Gobekli Tepe. How you guys doing? Okay, Laird, now, suppressed knowledge, right? Suppressed knowledge. And why would they do that to us? Well, I think they got a big surprise when those builders of Gobekli Tepe decided to deliberately bury it, to preserve it for us. What a gift, right?
That's absolutely true, and it's not the only site that was deliberately buried. And in some cases, we have better insights than we do at a Gobekli Tepe as to why they might have done it. But the only reason it's as well preserved as it is for us to see is because of that choice. We can tell by the material that was used to cover it over, and the care that was taken not to damage the carvings that you were talking about, that it was deliberately covered, not accidentally covered.
Now, we have to ask why, and this is what I find really interesting, and I always go back to 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the way that Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick chose to do the big reveal was the monolith on the moon that was deliberately buried. We unburied it. It sends off a signal and lets us know that we've reached a certain height in our evolution. Very, very interesting approach. And then Gobekli Tepe comes along, and it's also deliberately buried, and we didn't find it and didn't have the ability to do it and study it until we achieved a certain place in our evolution too as well. And right. I just find that very interesting because we're talking about monoliths in both cases. and that it was deliberately buried. Now, why would they deliberately bury it? Was it to preserve a library or a museum? You know, their culture for us today, that is certainly one idea. They didn't want it damaged. Maybe they knew some celestial event was about to kick off and they needed to save the site, which is also a brilliant theory too as well. Why do you think it was deliberately buried?
If we look at the other aspects of the symbolic tradition that this connects to, the later ones that connect to written language where they can tell us what they were thinking, we understand that the knowledge that underlies the whole thing is aimed at a technological audience. Only somebody who had access to a microscope or to a telescope was ever going to understand what the symbolism was about. So at 9,000 or 10,000 BC, that's a future audience. That's an unknown future audience, and no one would be able to predict how far in the future that might be. But if the whole goal was to aim at that future audience, then it's in the mindset to cover over a site and preserve it for that same future audience. Now, there are lots of different theories here. I think Schock's outlook is that era fell just before some major energetic cataclysms connected to the sun, and that the site was buried to preserve it. I can see sense in that outlook because we know that we have underground cities in the same region, in Cappadocia region. Mm-hmm. Why would entire groups of people choose to live underground if there weren't if conditions on the surface were still as livable as they are right now? That makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense to me is if you knew that a cataclysm was coming and you had a choice between spending the time between now and when it hits, preparing for it and preparing your family for it and making sure everybody you knew was safe, or protecting the one thing in your culture that was most likely to withstand it, which would you pick? I wouldn't choose to devote all my attention to the thing that's likely to withstand it anyway.
Okay, there's a lot of evidence that supports both sides.
Right, and the amount of airspace between the various theories is not all that great. I mean, we're all in the same ballpark under the same umbrella, so right. This is sort of nitpicking. But also I judge by another very important site that was deliberately buried over. That was on Orkney Island around 2600 BC. This is north of Scotland, where sites were deliberately buried, but when they buried them, they also left they left symbols all around the site before they buried it that tell us some things about why they buried it. And the implication is, okay, I have to back up a little bit here. At Gobekli Tepe, we had those circular structures that were carved out where they have the stone benches and the two pillars in the center and the carvings on the pillars, and you have what look like this series of circular sites, dozens of them that are being excavated there. That configuration of a site, the Dogon referred to by the term arc. Now, so Gobekli Tepe is literally an arc on a hillside near Ararat.
That's right. And let's say that the symbolism is there at Gobekli Tepe, but we just don't understand it. And,
right. Okay, so now that word arc is an Egyptian word that means to cover over.
Right.
And when you look at that word, you look at the symbols of that word, the symbols of that word act out a ritual. They spell out the stages of a ritual that survives in Judaism. In Judaism, every day in every temple around the Jewish temple around the world, they read a section of the Torah scroll, and it's timed that they all read the same section on the same day, and it's timed so that they get all the way through the Torah scroll in the course of a year. And at the end of the year, that they rewind the scroll and put it away. But every day when they finish reading that one portion, what they do is they deliberately and carefully cover over that scroll and set it back in a cabinet called an Aron HaKodesh, which gets abbreviated to Ark.
So, if that is the case, then we have to ask why.
Well, for Judaism, the reason they do it, the symbolism is, this is a way of designating that the instructional goal for this portion of what we were trying to do was brought to its proper completion. If it hadn't been, we wouldn't have gotten to the part where we cover it over and put it away.
But, okay, wait, let me jump in. This is great stuff. I feel smart already. But if that is the case, then it would be an extraordinarily important site for them, that's so important that they would want to bury it and preserve it, and family and everything else comes second. That would make sense to me.
Right, and it's not clear that the site was buried before the cataclysm happened, because we're talking about a span of about 1,000 years. The site was ostensibly unused for about 1,000 years. So it could be that the cataclysm happened and was over, and by the time it was over, then the community decided it was time to bury over the site. But symbolically, the act of burying it says to me, as a symbolist, it says, look, the thing we were trying to accomplish in the way of educating people was brought to its proper conclusion here. It didn't get interrupted. We were able to do what we intended to do, and then we covered it over, and part of the reason we covered it over is so that you'll be able to see that we finished that.
Now, and talking about symbolism, let's talk about what appears to be a zodiac. And the first time that I saw that pillar, I immediately jumped at zodiac. That it was rather apparent to me. Do you see a zodiac there?
I'm in agreement with French anthropologists who studied an African tribe that I work with called the Dogon. And in the Dogon system, the French anthropologists noticed that all of the elements that eventually became a zodiac were evident at around 3000 BC in Dogon culture. So yes, this is the same symbolic system for me. I trace the one I'm studying from Gobekli Tepe. I expect to see the elements of a zodiac there. I understand that those didn't get pulled together into a coherent form as far as we know until about the time of the Babylonians, which is much later.
Right. Well, I referred, to the zodiac in Dendera on the ceiling there. But yes, no matter how we take a look at that, that wasn't for another 8,000 years. So how is it possible? I seriously want your insight on this, your opinion. How is it possible that a culture 8,000 years before could develop the symbolism of a zodiac from celestial bodies and have it represented the exact same way, with the same animals and the same symbolism? That seems to me to be impossible.
Okay, well, let me explain it in the way I understand it. There are certain civilizing skills that we can see were being instructed at Gobekli Tepe. We listed them earlier. We're talking about metallurgy and stonemasonry and so on. But there are also other civilizing skills, some that are essential to agriculture, that we can't see. We don't have stone evidence of. One of those is the ability to keep time and keep a calendar. Now, in ancient times, especially in the Buddhist tradition, the first exercise they teach a Buddhist initiate is geometry that essentially creates a sundial. And that sundial allows a person to track the hours of a day over the course of a day by watching the shadows, the sun. We're all familiar with how the sundial works.
Right.
But the same geometry also allows them to plot an east-west oriented line every day, that if they plot it every day using shadows, they can watch that shadow move day by day further and further north until it reaches the solstice, and then back south again through the center of a geometric circle at the equinox, and then continues southward until the next solstice, and then it moves back. It gives visibility to the seasons of the year the same way that the shadow of the gnomon gives visibility to the hours of the day on a daily basis. So these timekeeping, now that all takes into consideration the concept of keeping time during the daytime. However, there are also reasons why we need to know what time it is at night. And that's done in a different way. That's done by defining the concept of constellations set at hour-long intervals apart from each other at night, so that we can watch these constellations rise on the horizon, and an hour later we see the next constellation rise, and an hour later we see the next constellation rise. Now we have a clock to go by at night. The symbolism for those constellations was represented in terms of animals the same way that symbolism on the pillars was represented in terms of animals. So this was a very early feature of this cosmological tradition. The reason everybody had it was because that's how everybody was taught to tell time.
Now, that works for me at 3000 BC. Okay, that concept works for me. If we back up, there's we can bring up Nabta Playa, 7000 BC, a calendar out in the middle of the desert in Egypt. And okay, so now we're pushing technology pretty far back. But going back to Gobekli Tepe and understanding what is going on at night, I have a hard time with that unless they were taught, unless they already had this knowledge, they were exposed to what constellations were, how to follow them, because Stone Age man isn't going to have that ability. You know what I did last night, Laird? Last night, I got out my iPhone that has night sky on it, right? A real-time map of the heavens, and you can track any star, anything. It's all there. And I'm sitting there with Rita last night. We were waiting for this constellation to appear, and the moon. It was a full moon last night, and we got tired of waiting. This stuff doesn't move, right? You're sitting out there forever. And I always picture how ancient man looked up to the heavens and understood this. I have the ability to do it with technology, right? I have books, I have people, I have you to tell me how this is done. I go out there underneath the stars. I don't have the patience for it. I don't know how they did it. It
does take patience, but you realize that back in the day they had nothing to do but look at the sky.
I know that's
they could sit around the campfire, they could tell stories. That's about we had, as I said, had our power go out this week for a period of time. It didn't come back on until around 2 a.m, and we got a chance to experience one more time firsthand what life is like when none of the normal things are available to a modern society or it's possible to do. You're sitting by candlelight and by battery-powered light and trying to read a book or trying to do anything you would normally do.
Now, there is nothing more fun than going out without any light pollution and just rocking your head back and looking straight up. There is nothing better. There's nothing. And if you don't stop looking up when you're in that position. There's no doubt about it. For them, it was their 4K high definition cinematic experience was going out at night and looking.
I agree completely. We heard a talk last week by an astronomer who was talking about the new TESS telescope that's up there that's mapping. It's actually searching for Earth-like planets very close to stars.
Yep.
And very, very nearby the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And the woman presented us with an image taken of a region of sky with absolutely no light pollution. Here's what it really looks like. We see 100 stars. They see 100 stars in a square inch.
Yes.
And it was such a compelling image that my wife, Risa, first thing she wanted to do when we came back was to print a copy of it so she could have it to look at.
It's incredible. We could spend a whole show on that. It's the greatest amount of research time that I do right now is cosmology and astrophysics and what is actually going on up there. TESS is a game changer. There's no doubt about it. And the imaging coming back is it's unbelievable. Extraordinary isn't even a strong enough word. How unbelievable it is. Now, back to Gobekli Tepe. And the reason why I want to stay on the zodiac and the idea of identifying what is going on up in the heavens at that period of time would suggest to me, nothing is discovered. Everything is taught. Everything is taught. It doesn't matter really what it is. Somebody taught you something. Discoveries are singular. I don't think that they discovered the zodiac or
No, I agree that, and the perspective of the ancient cultures I study is when you get to the bottom of it, they say, look, in ancient times, someone who thoroughly understood this taught it to us.
That's it. I mean, that's it. There's no other way to look at it, right?
Right. Nothing that makes sense to me.
Now, who would have taught that culture, on the Armenian highlands at 10,000 BC, right after the Ice Age? That's the other thing that starts to baffle everything. But who would that culture have been?
That's true. Well, that's what ties into the perspective of people like John Anthony West and Graham Hancock, who are compelled to believe that these were survivors of a culture that understood the science, because the end of the Ice Age is a moment where geologically the seas would rise and cultures would be inundated and bad things would happen, and where someone might need a fresh start. As a matter of fact, where the ancient Egyptians talk about a first time, and the Buddhists talk about the first time that knowledge was transmitted to humanity by a Buddha, the Dogon talk about a time when humanity was restored to culture. So the Dogon perspective is automatically one of, look, this is not the first time humanity has risen to a high level of culture. We've been restored to it in the past.
So are you okay? If we go with that concept, and certainly the survivors from another event, and we have the Ice Age there, are we pushing back things? Was this culture 50,000 years old? Was this culture survivors from 100,000 years prior?
And we have no way of judging that is our problem, because the Ice Age serves as an effective block to evidence.
That's right. That's right. And it allows, I mean, for me, almost any theory, any idea needs to be listened to here, because none of it makes any sense, right?
Well, none of it makes any sense in terms of what we've been traditionally taught to think. Right. that any idea we're going to entertain here is going to step outside of our comfort zone in one way or another.
And are you okay with that? And why isn't academia, science and anthropology is supposed to be about asking questions and fixing it and moving on? Science is nothing but a string of things that broke. And I'm talking about math. I'm talking about ideas and theories that were corrected and fine-tuned, found to be wrong, moved on. It's one string of asking questions. Otherwise, we'd still have a flat Earth, right? That's the way we would be dealing with things. But we correct things. Why don't they go back and correct this and ask questions and try to figure out how this all happened to begin with? Why don't they do that? Why are they afraid of asking questions?
Well, they've done too good a job of structuring the fields of study, that your average researcher might trip to these ideas, might even consider them very seriously in their own privacy, but the structures of academia don't really allow them the freedom very often to step outside of the boundaries and propose that something that's really off the wall might be true.
And we have evidence of this mindset just about every turn that we take throughout history, don't we?
Right. I mean, and it's evidence very often you can point a scientist to and say, look, here's where your perspective on things doesn't add up for me. Could you explain it to me? I have a friend who was a graduate student in astrophysics who reached a point of frustration with his professors, because every time he would come down to one of those questions where he'd say, but what do you mean we have to take dimensions as a given? Why aren't our definitions defined in a way that explain to us where dimensions come from? He would get what he considered to be BS answers from his professors. And he finally said, look, I can't take this anymore. I'm going to go reformulate the system for myself, working from the ground up, and see what I can produce.
And if we haven't even talked, well, we're going to get into Egypt next here after the break. But if we just accepted everything the way it is written today, we don't move forward, right? If we accept Egypt, if we accept Mesopotamia, if we accept, because they want to say, and I'm talking about archaeologists and anthropologists and historians that study culture, their answer is a blanket statement. Well, you're not giving enough credit to ancient man. They were actually more creative. That's their answer. There's no scientific significance to that type of answer, but it's their fallback for anything that is skeptical, isn't it?
Yeah, and because of the situation they're in professionally, it really has to be. And that's one of the things I like about being involved in a group of alternative researchers is that we're in a position to be able to entertain an idea that falls outside the bounds of what any traditional researcher would look at and follow it and chase it and try to find the ways, test whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense, and not be limited by some authorities' sense of what we should or shouldn't be looking at.
Now, one last question about Gobekli Tepe. When we come back, we'll jump into Egypt next. But with Gobekli Tepe and the symbolism that is there, that is your area of expertise. Are you leaning on a religious site? Are you leaning on something more astrological? Or is it something else altogether?
My perspective on things comes out of an ancient philosophy in India called Samkhya. It's a companion to yoga, and it's a philosophy that's expressly non-theistic. It's scientific in outlook, and it starts with the understanding that universes form in pairs, one non-material and one material, and it discusses the relationship between those two universes and how the dynamics of energy work between those universes. So my perspective, I would call, there is certainly a spiritual aspect to that, especially if you are going to equate the term non-material with spiritual, which in many times they can be synonymous. So my perspective is essentially that. It's at the roots of religion, but it's not religious in the traditional sense.
Are you running for political office?
I should be, yes. Samkhya has the same outlook as yoga does. As a matter of fact, it's all the same concepts applied. I have a daughter who studies yoga, and she'll come and explain a concept to me that she learned from a yoga instructor, and it's some advanced concept, and she'll start the sentence, and I'll finish it because the terms are all the same. I know what they mean cosmologically, and I can apply that to what she's saying to yoga. It's all the same stuff. This is not religious in the modern traditional sense of it. It's religious in the sense that Buddhism or Buddhism is probably the closest to the mindset. It's not. Buddhism is not about celebration of a deity, but it is about understanding how creation works.
And I understand you want to be non-committal. Okay, that's fine because we don't really understand. But when I look at it, I let my imagination go. And Laird, Gobekli Tepe makes no sense to me. It doesn't make any sense. I want it to be celestial. I want it to be E.T. I want it to be aliens. I want it to be religious. I want it to be something, but I can't get there with any direction.
Well, the Buddhists say their most sacred symbols came from a non-human source.
Right.
The Dogon say not only was it non-human, it was originally non-material. So the Dogon outlook is not of traditional sci-fi aliens, although there are perspectives that potentially tie to that.
Mm-hmm.
The official Dogon perspective is one of more of interdimensionality between a non-material and a material universe than of spaceships coming from Sirius.
Yeah, and I've got to take a break right here, but this is, for me, collectively, what is so amazing about Gobekli Tepe is the leaders of that culture convinced the civilization that it was more important, that site was so important that it had to get built. And if you think about the commitment of resources, because it wasn't, I doubt it was a city of 10,000 people, right? Collectively, they had to make the building of that site, which must have taken, a couple of thousand years, right? To build it, that it had to take precedence over everything else. So what was so important? It's crazy.
Well, when we get back from break, I'll give you a 2-sentence perspective on that.
Let's take our break right here. I'm already running late. Our guest tonight is Laird Scranton. We're doing it all tonight. Gobekli Tepe. We're going to discuss Egypt, and we're going to get some Velikovsky in. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. We'll be right back after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. What a great week we've got. Oh, man. Tonight, Laird Scranton. Tomorrow night, Freddie Silva right here. Wednesday night, Francisco Osa. And then Thursday night, we're not going to do Fader Night. Won't be open lines. Thursday night, we're going to do the film Extraordinary here. Extraordinary, the seating. With director Joe Sumple. He's going to be here, as well as the writer Jack Roth. And we're going to discuss the making of the film and its possible impact on audiences worldwide and its release. We'll be talking about all of that on Thursday. But tonight, it is Laird Scranton. Now, Laird, I want to talk about suppressed history. I don't think anything has been more effective than Egypt and ancient Egypt. And I find it so easy to go there. Why are Egyptologists so quick to just follow the dogma?
Well, there is where the pattern was set for academic turf and academic theories that needed protecting, large investments in a particular perspective, competitive egos who wanted to be the ones credited with making a particular discovery, and you get a lot of boundaries, academic boundaries between fields of study and so forth. That's sort of where the pattern was set that we see in some other areas of academic. So that was sort of ripe for restricting certain knowledge to certain people. Zawi Hawass is a person who plays cards very close to his chest about discoveries. Surely he knows things about the Giza Plateau that he isn't being, always immediately forthcoming about. It's hard to say what the ultimate motive is. I think that there's information here that is very significant. From my point of view, it fundamentally belongs to humanity in the same way that it's the fundamental right of a person, if they find a seed on the ground, to try to plant it and try to expect something to grow from it if they handle it properly. That's a fundamental human right. If someone tried to corner the market on seeds, I would say that's a violation of humanity in the same way that trying to corner the market on ancient knowledge would be.
I just watched a documentary on the muon experiments by both Japanese groups that went in and found the new chamber above the Grand Gallery. The documentary, this was on a PBS, might have been Nova, pretty extraordinary. But this is what I did see. Zahi has managed to wiggle his way back into the antiquities part of the Egyptian government. And what was interesting, though, and I'm not making this up, Laird, when he walked down a hallway or into a room, everybody around, they were like dropping to their knees and bowing, like freaking out. It's Zahi. I was just... His ego is so out of control. He's stopping and starting meetings that he has nothing to do with technically. He's not part of it anymore. And he is controlling what was going on and how this muon experiment and testing was going to occur, all from outside of the antiquities department. It was crazy to watch and witness. This guy is way out of control.
Well, speaking of my friend John Anthony West again, he had respect for Zawi. I mean, I I know the two of them had their differences and fairly significant differences, but in the end, John would say, it's always okay if you understand him and what where he's coming from and what is trying to accomplish. So it's not like a cut and dried issue. This is a complicated man, and there's a lot there to understand about him.
Well, did you see that? I don't want to stay on him too much here because I'm just going to inflame the audience. But the video of Graham Hancock speaking to Hawass about Gobekli Tepe and how important it was, and Hawass turns to Graham and he goes, "What are you talking? I've never heard of this Gobekli Tepe." And it's just like, dude, stop with that. All right? Only because it interferes with their dogma.
Well, yeah, so because the same way that an individual academic might have an ego, so do individual countries. And Egypt does not want its place as the premier ancient civilization to be knocked out of the seat.
That makes sense. It does. It makes sense. And this poor audience is so drunk right now. Gobekli Tepe. But okay, so back to Egypt. The significance of the Great Pyramid and its lack of hieroglyphics of any kind,
right,
except for the purported graffiti. Let's just go with graffiti, right, in the upper relief chamber. Allegedly discovered by Colonel Weiss, and I say allegedly with kindness.
Right.
Okay. So
there's certainly lots of dispute over what might have happened, and it's the same kind of dispute you see typically in a Facebook discussion. There are lots of minutia points of view about, down to analyzing the ink that was used to make these quarry marks and the way the glyphs were set out vertically or horizontally, and all sorts of very, very minute details to question, was this legitimate, was it not legitimate? Very complicated questions. For me, the easiest perspective for why we find no carved inscriptions in the Great Pyramid is because it was built before writing, before the inscriptions were a thing.
Bingo.
And if so, then it certainly was built before 3000 BC.
That's right. And what is wrong with asking that question? What is wrong with that?
Right. There's nothing wrong with that. Very, very tricky questions to try to answer, though.
Well, it seems that if you're an Egyptologist that wants to step outside the box and ask these very fundamental questions, these aren't crazy questions. They're fundamental questions. You just don't do it. They absolutely will not, and will point to anything that they can to suggest that, including that 2-inch statue of Khafre, Khufu, that is what they have, and let's move on. I get uncomfortable with that.
Right. Well, this is where Schock and John West's work was so pivotal, because they were the first ones to come up with a rationale that had to be addressed.
So, yes. Now, the lack of hieroglyphics, where we have anywhere in Saqqara, anywhere that you want to go, any other pyramid, any other complex, any other temple, any other site is adorned from top to bottom. The most significant site in all of the world lacks anything. Now, what is so hard to figure out here?
Right. I mean, if Occam was here, he would say, let's go with the easy answer. The easy answer is it was built before we had written language.
So if we start to connect the dots, and we could almost include the Dogon in here too as well, but if we start to connect the dots, are we suggesting that it is possible that the very same information and cultures that built Gobekli Tepe could be responsible at the same time period, because we're going back to 10,500 BC here?
Okay, here's the perspective on that as far as I'm concerned. If we embrace the idea, Robert Bauval's idea, that the three large pyramids reflect the belt stars of Orion at 10,000 BC, and that the Sphinx's gaze is pointed towards Leo at 10,000 BC, if we're going to entertain that as being a valid perspective, then we're left with two choices. One choice is that at least the alignments were set in the era of 10,000 BC for those structures. If we don't say that, then we have to imagine that thousands of years later, when the structures are built, somebody had the capability of retrospectively calculating what the alignment should have been. And I don't see any evidence that anybody could. So my best guess is that the Sphinx and at least the alignments for the pyramids are contemporaneous with Gobekli Tepe. They would have to be.
And the carbon dating of the materials at Gobekli Tepe, which absolutely have been done over and over again now, we can definitively say 10,000 BC and areas of it that are actually older, right? And you even said yourself it could be 1,000 years. It could be older than that. We don't know. We haven't done completing the digging at Gobekli Tepe. Wouldn't it be fantastic if it went 20,000 years? That would certainly.
I mean, John Anthony West's view of the Sphinx was it might well go back. Okay, we're talking about what are essentially precessional cycles, yuga cycles.
That's right.
Talking about 12,500 year half cycles or 25,000 year full cycles. It's in his estimation, it was possible that the Sphinx went back another full cycle, possibly even 30,000 years back.
Now, here's the $1 million question. Do you think that there is evidence in possession and knowledge from any aspect, whether it's carving, literal, papyrus, it doesn't matter, that Egyptologists know that the Giza complex predates their own dating, but they're not going to talk about it? Do you think that they know for sure?
I think that somebody in the field of Egyptology, I think that people in the field of government and people, no doubt people at the Vatican, know the truth of the situation or have a much clearer sense of what the truth is. And I think that they know that these cycles of humanity go back farther than anybody has admitted that they do.
Isn't there a benefit to that knowledge? Isn't there a benefit for us to find out the truth? I mean, I understand religion and I understand the economy of Egypt and the need of keeping the money flow going. I understand all of that. But isn't there a benefit for all of us to find out our true origins?
Well, from my perspective, one of the key motivations of whoever put the symbolic system together in ancient times was because they felt that it was essential for humanity to know the truth about this and to preserve it down through the ages. Somebody went to an awful lot of trouble to set up symbolic techniques, extended metaphors, very careful ways of putting myths together, very careful ways of putting architecture together, very careful ways of representing geometry and mathematics, specifically so that this body of knowledge would not get lost down through the generations. It was important to them that humanity understand it and that we be able to preserve it. So absolutely, I think that there's a huge motive that most of us don't really fathom what that could be. And my best guess is that there are people on the planet who understand what that, what lies behind that.
If another Gobekli Tepe, another site surfaces, it doesn't even have to be in the Armenian highlands. It doesn't have to be in Africa. What if it, here in North America, for instance, or South America, or China, another site is revealed that even is older than Gobekli Tepe, but definitively suggests the crazy stuff that they don't want us to know, right? Even more definitive than Gobekli Tepe. I can't imagine it going there. But suppose it actually happened. Could you handle it? Could you handle the knowledge of an intelligent civilization that is 15,000 years old?
Yeah, I think knowing with the perspective that I have on things, I think that's almost a given. Just looking at Egyptian language, okay, one of the questions I asked myself studying Gobekli Tepe was, what did the ancient Egyptians call that region of the world? Well, it turns out the Egyptian term for it was a word, Get Pet Kai.
No,
it's an archaic word.
No.
Pet Kai is pretty close. This is their name for Cappadocia, which is the region where Gobekli Tepe is.
Right.
Now, the symbols of the words are formulated in a way, in an archaic way. It begins with the image of a shrine, and it ends with a symbol of mountains. This is the name of a mountaintop shrine. Now, it's not the only name of a mountaintop shrine that's preserved in the Egyptian language. There's a second name that is formulated the same way. So from my point of view, and the second name, I don't have a site to specifically connect with yet, but the fact that there's a second name implies to me that there's a second site.
Is that true?
It's true. Yeah,
I'm serious. Say it again for me.
Okay, the
name of the region. Say it again.
Get Pet Kai. Now, but as I said, that's an archaic word. It's written with glyphs that are a match. I mean, they're the same glyphs the Egyptians used to write any word.
Right.
But in ancient times, they assigned different phonetic values to certain glyphs, and they formulated words in a different way. So another thing I tried to do with that word Get Pet Kai was I asked myself, what would happen if you updated the pronunciation of the glyphs? What would it read then? What it read was Het Pet Ka Ya. Now, Het Pet Ka Ya, Het is a word for a sanctuary. That means sanctuary. Pet is the name of an Egyptian god of space. Ka is the name of an Egyptian god of the embrace. Ya is the Hebrew god of light. We have the name of an ancient sanctuary preserved in ancient Egyptian language that looks like it combines the names of three Egyptian gods, or three ancient gods. Not just Egyptian, it actually spans Hebrew gods and Egyptian gods. Now, the second site, the same thing is true with. If you pronounce it the archaic way, it's Ga-Nu Sa Ast. Now, Ga-Nu Sa is Ganesha. Ast is a word for Isis, which is Sirius.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But if you modernize the term, it is pronounced Het Penu Ka. Let's see if I get this right. Het Penu Sa Ast is what it is. Now, Penu, okay, I knew that Sa was an ancient name for Orion. It's a name of an Egyptian god of knowledge. Ast, again, is Isis, which is Sirius. And Penu is a term that in India became a generic term for deity. In ancient Egypt, Penu was a word for a shrew mouse, and a shrew mouse was actually celebrated at two of the key ancient Egyptian temple sites. One of them, whose name is formulated by those same syllables as Get Pet Kai, is the site that the Greek word for Egypt came from. Egypt is called Egypt because of this site where this shrew mouse, whose name is represented as Penu, was celebrated. So again, we have a second archaic sanctuary site. We can tell it's the name of a sanctuary because of the way the glyphs read, named for three gods that cross pantheons. They cross, some of them are Egyptian, some of them are Indian. So it's really weird stuff. It implies that what survived in each of these ancient traditions were all part of a larger body of knowledge originally, and only some pieces survived in certain places.
When I was, really getting into my studies with ancient Egypt and the demigods and ancient Egypt before the pharaohs, and I started to, I'll never forget the first time that I started to make the connection with Zeb Tepe, right? First time.
Right.
And Gobekli Tepe. Now, I don't like to say, I use the word coincidence or it's just strange but is there a connection, obviously, with Tepe and Gobekli Tepe? Is it just phonetic?
Well, that's another story for you. The night before Schock and John West left to go visit Gobekli Tepe, John Anthony West held a party at his house that my wife Risa and I were invited to. And so in preparation for that party, I knew that Schock and his wife were going to be there and some other people were going to be there. So in preparation for the party, I did some study, the original study that I did on the Gobekli Tepe site. I wanted to be able to talk reasonably intelligently about what the site was about.
Sure.
So I asked myself that question about the word tepe. Could there be a relationship? I went to the modern Turkish language, and I discovered that the word tepe has 25 separate meanings in the modern Turkish language. Now, if you go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, that's, from 2500, these are words that are represented from 2500 BC or earlier. A dozen of those same meanings are connected to words that are pronounced tep or tepe. So in other words, we can say with confidence that when the ancient Egyptians said the word tepe, they meant the same thing that the ancient Turks meant when they said tepe. It's the same word.
What does it mean? Hill, mound, center,
again, each of these words, as I said, in the Turkish language, the word tepe has 25 different meanings. So if you ask someone to translate the word Gobekli Tepe, you can potentially get 25 different translations per each word. I mean, Gobekli has multiple meanings and Tepe has multiple meanings. So you can get a whole slew of different interpretations of what the name means based on who translates it for you.
Now, when you say Turkish and modern Turkish, Turkey wasn't, it's a 600-year-old country.
Right.
So Gobekli Tepe is, 10,000, 12,000 years old.
Right. Now, there's a feature of language that is, there are two features of language that are of particular help to us before the advent of writing. One of them is the tendency, as we go back further in time, for greater and greater commonality of language among cultures. This is sort of Tower of Babel stuff. The second feature of language is something that linguists refer to as ultra-conserved words. It's the idea that a word that is very significant tends to stay in a language for very long periods of time. And so all of those ancient words that had to do with concepts of creation, words that connect to the concept of a cubit, or that relate to the constellation Orion, or things that are very significant to a culture or to their religious tradition, the words are going to tend to stay in the language for very, very long periods of time. And so that allows me to compare words in a modern Turkish dictionary to words in an ancient Egyptian dictionary and find lots and lots of overlap.
That's very interesting. And it just sticks out like a sore thumb to me.
Now, the same thing happens with ancient China. I can actually demonstrate very easily that the ancient Chinese hieroglyphs were formulated to be on the same system as the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. I can demonstrate it with one word. I think we've talked about this before. This is the Egyptian word for week, like the concept of days of a week. Mm-hmm. It's written with two glyphs. The sun glyph, which is a circle with a dot, that can represent the concept of a day, and an upside-down U, which is the Egyptian number 10. I looked at that word and I said, symbolically, this word says 10 days. And I went and I did some research and discovered the ancient Egyptians had a 10-day week. Wow, the glyphs of the word explained its own meaning to me. So then I go to the ancient Chinese language and I discovered their word for week was written with two glyphs. A sun glyph that was originally a circle with a dot, and their number 10, and they had a 10-day week also.
I'm looking at it right here. It's the same thing.
Yeah, it's absolute comparability at a fundamental level for how these languages were originally formulated.
I drew. It's the wow. And I drew it out. I'm going to show everybody in my notes here, right? I drew it out here, and then just look it up. Ancient Chinese word for week. Just go and do that, and look at the images that pop up. It's exactly what I drew.
So now I said, okay, if one Egyptian word works that way, what are the chances that other Egyptian words do too? And what I discovered is they all work that way. If I want to know what an Egyptian word meant, if I want to know what the scribe meant when he wrote down the word, I can interpret the individual glyphs of the words, and they will tell me flat out what he meant.
It's all there. It's all there. The dot is even in between.
Right.
That is trippy. And I just drew it out in Egyptian as you described it to me. It's right there. That's crazy.
Now, the next really interesting thing is there are certain Egyptian words where there's a trailing glyph at the end of the word that doesn't get pronounced. Those words are there to define for us what the meaning of the glyph, that trailing glyph, is. And so once you figure that out, then you can lay out a whole long list of hundreds of Egyptian glyphs and what they mean based on what the language tells you they mean, not based on what we guess they mean.
Let's take our break right here. Got to do it. This is Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Laird Scranton. We're discussing lost history, suppression of knowledge, Gobekli Tepe, Egypt, and Velikovsky. We'll do it all when we come back. Stay with us. What a conversation tonight, Laird Scranton. The absolute best. You know, and this is, for me, and just like I talked about in my opening rant tonight on the show, for me, it's about discovery, having a conversation, and for all of you out there to just ride along with us. And it's just been amazing tonight, Laird. Great conversation. And we're talking about suppression of knowledge and lost history. And I don't think there is anything more evident than what Velikovsky had to say and his theories. Again, going outside of the box and getting some scientific evidence together and presenting it. And certainly he was well read and a revelation throughout the world, but he was attacked on all sides, wasn't he?
He really was. He's considered to this day to be the crackpot's crackpot. Never mind the fact that most of what he represented to be true has since shown itself to be true. As a matter of fact, we're talking about an intensely popular book that he published in 1950 called Worlds in Collision. This was a very radical theory based on ancient references that claimed that the planet Venus had to be far younger an astronomical body than anybody thought it was. That in fact, Venus had been born during the historical memory of humanity and had been originally born in the form of a comet that sort of wreaked havoc in the plane of the orbits of the planets for millennia, and then finally settled down into its own orbit and took its place among the family of planets.
Now, let's stay right here for a second. If you are going to present something as radical as this, you have to have it backed up. You just can't wing it. And he presented that side of it, and I understand it's not going to be enough to convince anybody. But the other side of it is nobody really knows how Earth or our moon or anything else was created. Nobody really knows. So why not have this idea put out there alongside of other scientific ideas and theories about the creation of everything? Why not present it that way?
Well, the truth of the matter is we had been talking earlier about the TESS satellite, which is looking for Earth-like planets.
Yep.
Well, it follows on the Kepler project with the telescope out there. They've done quite a bit of research on Earth-like planets. They found some 4,000 potential Earth-like planets out there so far, and the astronomers who study those have come around to points of view on how planets form that aligns perfectly with what Velikovsky says, their outlook. I wrote, when I wrote my book, The Velikovsky Heresies, I was in contact with Jeff Marcy, who at that time was Berkeley's head of the search for Earth-like planets using the Kepler project. Mm-hmm. And he would graciously allow me to send him questions that he would answer sort of under the table and give me make sure I was on the right track in terms of what I was looking for. The official viewpoint, the adopted viewpoint of these exosolar system astronomers is that gas giant planets form in the first 10 million years of a star's life, and that the rocky planets form in the next 10 million years largely as a result of collisions. Well, Velikovsky said that Venus formed as a result of a large astronomical body, a planet that size body 10 times the size of the Earth, crashing into Jupiter. So if we say that the rocky planets form as a result of collisions, there is no upper limit on when that could occur. That could happen tomorrow if the right circumstances came about. So because of the study of these exosolar systems, it now is a situation where the two working theories we have for how planets formed in our solar system no longer hold water. They're contradicted, flatly contradicted by what we see in the exosolar systems. So we're really without an official working theory, and the one that the exosolar astronomers have is really in line with what Velikovsky says, although nobody will admit it.
What kind of evidence do we have that backs up this from ancient astronomers in the past that were making notes of what was happening up in the skies?
Well, the earliest, Velikovsky did his research at Columbia University Library, where original papyruses and ancient texts of all sorts from all sorts of different cultures around the world were housed, along with experts who were capable of interpreting them. And what Velikovsky discovered was that in culture after culture, originally Venus was identified as a comet, and there was a name assigned to that comet that might be different from culture to culture, but whatever name they assigned to that comet was the same name that they eventually assigned to the planet Venus. So the word typhon was originally the name of that our word typhoon comes from. Was originally the name of a comet. And these names also typically tie to cataclysmic events on the Earth, the way typhoon does. So, go ahead. So what Velikovsky was seeing was evidence of global disruption during the era when Venus was a comet, not a planet.
And what about translations of since Velikovsky of ancient text? Does this corroborate what he was presenting?
One of the big corroborations for what Velikovsky has to say is that ancient cultures became obsessed with Venus for reasons that don't make sense if it wasn't menacing us in some way. In China, we were talking about ancient language. The earliest system of writing in China is what's called the oracle bone texts. These are characters that were carved into shin bones and thigh bones of animals. And their purpose, the working theory of linguists is that this language was specifically developed to track the motions of Venus. So as we look at the various cultures who were keeping these obsessive tables of where Venus was, how long it was visible and how long it was not visible, they were looking for anything unusual in the movements of Venus, because it was as if there was some urgent dependency on knowing where Venus was. You look at these ancient tables, which, if Venus had always been a planet, should be like clockwork.
Stable.
Astronomy says that the motions of the planets and the stars are irregular. So we should be able to take these tables and make sense of them in terms of what we see today with Venus. It turns out we can't make sense of any of the tables from any culture. They don't tie out without major fudge factors.
And the reason for that is because Venus and its orbit wasn't stabilized yet. In fact, our solar system was in flux.
Well, yes. In fact, in Velikovsky's view, Venus made a direct impact on Mars, which is an outlook that is actually supported by studies of damage to Mars's crust, that it was hit by a planet-sized body sometime in the past. His outlook is that both Venus and Mars ended up making close approaches to the Earth about the time that every culture on the planet changed from a 360-day year to a 365-day year. There are all sorts of things that support Velikovsky's view. What I did with my book was, relying on modern sources that Velikovsky didn't have access to, I went through and examined each of the major aspects of his scenario for the birth of Venus, looking for any fact that would tip the controversy one way or the other. I didn't care whether he was right or whether he was wrong.
Sure.
I thought we ought to be able to point to something that solves this. And what I discovered was that at every stage of the controversy, there were a half a dozen considerations that, if Velikovsky's right, just evaporate. And if he's wrong, the astronomers have to come up with some extraordinary explanation for why this thing was the way that it was.
And what dates are we looking at here? I mean, there's a couple BC. What are those dates?
Well, the point at which Velikovsky says Venus made a close approach to the Earth was around 1500 BC. This coincides with a major volcanic period when the volcano of Thera erupted and is credited with having destroyed the Minoan Empire and having actually defined the boundary between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom in ancient Egypt. So 1500 BC is one of those critical points. Venus would have to have been born in eras prior to that, but again, we can't get past further than 3000 BC with written language to be able to reference things. But sometime within the historical memory of humanity, Venus looks like it was born.
Now,
another critical juncture around 709 BC.
Right. Let's stay right there for a second. At 1500 BC, we can call that ancient. Okay, all right, 1500 BC, but it's not ancient. We're talking about modern memories here. So, you know,
I mean, that's closer. That's 500 years closer to biblical times than we are.
Yeah, exactly. So if that is the case, what cultures around the world at 1500 BC made note of this astronomical event about a new star or a planet appearing in the sky?
Every one of them that we know was conducting astronomy was concerned about it. Every one of them inexplicably doesn't class Venus among the planets.
Right.
It classes it with the sun and the moon. They say they describe being able to see Venus move across the sky during the daytime.
Was this mainly Asia? Are we talking about like China, India?
We're talking South America. We're talking China. We have synchronized records from Korea and China that at one point there's a supernova that they know happened on a particular date, and it's recorded synchronously in China and in Korea, where the astronomers in both locations described the supernova as looking. Supernova was bright with rays extending from the sides of it like Venus.
And what happened at, this is just great stuff. Let's go to 709.
Okay, 709 BC is a huge juncture because there are major changes that happen that affect our ability to do things. You were talking about using star software to track the constellations back. Mm-hmm. Well, those calculations don't work across the 709 BC boundary without fudge factors.
How so?
Every total eclipse of the sun that has occurred since 709 BC has been confirmed through mathematics to the location and the date when it occurred.
That's
positively
right.
Confirmed.
That's right.
Not a single total eclipse of the sun that happened before 709 BC in any culture can be confirmed or has been confirmed.
Now, how would that be possible?
Well, that's only okay if you imagine that eclipses happen like clockwork. This is based on the relationship of the movements of the sun, the moon, and the earth. That as they work as clockwork, on a regular basis, the moon stands between our perspective of the sun, between us and our perspective of the sun at regular intervals.
Yes.
We can calculate that. The only thing that potentially can affect that is a change in the motions of those bodies.
How many times a year do we have a total eclipse somewhere on planet Earth?
That I can't tell you off the top of my head. I know that in ancient times they have 40 in China alone, total eclipses of the sun that happened in China before 709 BC that were reported by reliable observers. Now, when I say reliable observers, I'm saying these observers are considered reliable enough that all of our timelines of history are based on the observation. The historians say this is absolutely a reliable statement. The astronomers are fudging and saying, well, there's got to be something out of line here, that the guy must not have told us really what the truth was because we can't calculate the eclipse based on what he said.
Yeah, and it's my memory, and I could be wrong here. Just save your email, everybody. But I think we have a total eclipse somewhere on planet Earth once a year. Right? I think that's what it equates to. But
well, I know that they say that somewhere in the world there's a woman having a baby every minute, and we need to find that woman and stop her.
Right. So
that's the level of statistics
right.
I work with.
So if we look at it that way, once a year, twice every 3 years, and you go back throughout time, through millennia, we are talking about a large number of eclipses that happen over populated areas. And when that happens, I've seen a total eclipse, and it's pretty crazy to witness. And what happens for those minutes during the eclipse. It's a crazy. Have you gone through a total eclipse?
Yes, I've been through a couple, actually, and it is crazy.
It's crazy. I can't even explain how strange it is to go through. But anyway, if you're in a culture somewhere on this planet from today, going back, and you witness a total eclipse, that is an event. That is an event that is noted.
To give you some perspective on what the kind of crazy thing that's happening during say a total eclipse of the sun, I don't know if you've ever interviewed a woman named Maria Wheatley from England. She works with energy of megalithic sites, and she straddles the scientific field as well as the more fringe fields that I'm connected with. She's been involved in scientific studies of the energies that come off of these megalithic stones at places like Avebury. And one of the things they measured was what happens to, there's certain energies associated with the moon and other energies associated with the sun that are sort of considered opposites to each other. She says that during a total eclipse, those cancel each other out. That their instrumentation registers that the energy drops to zero during a total eclipse.
I can see that. I mean, what I noted from my total eclipse thing, which was 2 years ago, was that everything went to like sepia tone, right? It was this crazy discolor. Everything lacked color.
Right.
That was the first thing, and it was everything, right? It was weird to go through that. But the second thing was the sudden temperature drop.
Right.
Because we were in a 100-degree situation, 90 degrees, and then suddenly it was like 60. And I'm not exaggerating. You could feel it got cold, right?
But this is interesting because it brings us back to we were talking about how they find Earth-like planets. The way they find them is they watch the light energy that's coming towards the telescope, and when the planet passes between us and the sun, the energy level drops. The same way you're saying it drops during an eclipse.
Yes.
That's exactly how they find them.
And the third thing that happened was the silence.
Right.
Suddenly, nothing. The energy went to zero. it's weird when you hear all of nature suddenly just go mum.
Yep.
And it was like for 10 minutes, this surreal sepia toned, cold, silent netherworld.
Right.
So if I'm in an ancient culture and I go through that, I take note.
That's right. So getting back to the 709 BC, you have all sorts of weird things happen at that boundary. First of all, we can no longer calculate those solar eclipses, which are our anchor points for astronomy. If we can't say definitively what date and what place a solar eclipse happened, we have no idea. We have no basis to make an argument where the stars were in relation to us.
And you also lose calendar. You also lose dating.
Right, that's right. And what that means is that any researcher who's making an argument for alignments to the stars based on calculations of software prior to 709 BC, to a certain extent, is talking through their hat, because we have no definite knowledge of where the stars were in relation to us then.
So how if all of this is the case, and I would say that the historical record is the historical record, and then we go back to Velikovsky, where now we have the cross-checking, right? Because that's what you need. You need data, and the data now supports this. Where does that leave his legacy? How accurate was he?
Well, almost weekly, a new scientific discovery turns up or is announced that supports him. There was one this week. It was actually a scientific finding that repeats a study that came out. They didn't say it repeats it, but I know it repeats findings that were made by a Chinese group back in the early 2000s. The announcement was made that they've concluded that Jupiter was struck by a large body, and that explains why the core is half the size it should be and twice as hot as it should be. That's the kind of energetic event that Carl Sagan said would have had to have happened to birth Venus from Jupiter. That's one of the arguments he used against Velikovsky, was that, hey, you would have had to have large portions of Jupiter vaporized, and they would still be intensely hot today if that had happened.
Now, do you think that there is an astrophysicist or an astronomer or a cosmologist that is going to be Robert Schockish, right? That is willing to put tenure and their reputation on the line and come out and say, hey, there may be something to Velikovsky, and we really need to go back and take another look, that Venus may only be 2,500 years old.
No, that is professional suicide for an astronomer.
It would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and so I don't honestly believe there's going to be anybody who does that, even though the more closely you look at it, the more every single finding does that, supports Velikovsky, and even to the point that these days, when they announce those new findings that could support him, they're usually announced hand in hand with a second announcement whose effect is to distance that first one from Velikovsky.
And
I'll give you an example. On the Velikovsky had said that when we got to Venus, we would discover that because it's young, its surface was very pristine compared to what we expect of a very old planet. It wouldn't have all the cratered, the pockmark crater impacts on it. Well, sure enough, we got to Venus, discovered it had a very pristine surface, and the astronomers said, well, clearly what happened here was that geology that we don't understand somehow globally resurfaced Venus in the last million years.
Yeah. Plate tectonics.
Right. And so my outlook is
right.
You're really going to prefer relying on geology that we have no theoretical basis for over what Velikovsky said.
Now, I know, I want the audience to know that Laird is with us live from New York. He's on the East Coast, but I'm not ready, Laird, to stop this conversation. So can I get you to hang on for a little overtime? Sure. Because when we come back, you spoke about TESS, and you just went to a conference and saw a presentation about TESS. And I want to talk about that and the recent discoveries that are going on, not only in our own Milky Way, but what is going on in our universe. Can you stay right there?
Sure, absolutely.
That's what I'm talking about, Laird Scranton. Hey, Laird, you should. I don't know if you're on Twitter right now, but you need to see everybody's reactions to this conversation. It is absolutely wonderful. Laird Scranton is our guest. Let's do some overtime. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Network and KGRA, The Planet. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church, doing overtime. Laird Scranton. But you expected that. Great conversation tonight. Before we move on, I do want to talk about tests and recent discoveries. But I just got an interesting tweet here, Laird, directed at you.
Okay.
And this is Laird was wondering if you have an opinion on the half-circle seal on one of the granite leaves in the Great Pyramid. It's the only symbol in the entire pyramid, yet no one talks about it. It's before the king's chamber.
Let's see. I'm not familiar with that symbol. I'll see if I can. I'm
looking at it here. It's on the drop down right before you enter the king's chamber. There are the drop down granite slabs that are in those slots.
Right.
And on the second granite slab.
Yeah, but I see it here.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you're on Twitter. You're looking at it.
I looked it up on Google Images.
Okay. Google's going to be huge. I hear it's going to be big.
Okay, so that kind of a half circle, cosmologically speaking, is a representation of the moon, but it's also symbolic of the non-material. It's when the Dogon represent Sirius and the sun coming together, which is a metaphor for the non-material and material domains coming together. That half circle symbol represents that. You see the same thing on one of the Gobekli Tepe pillars. You see half moon symbolism that taken together, that with a sun glyph is one of the ways of representing a sanctuary. Mm-hmm. Another way is with three hemispheres or arches, which is those three handbag shapes on the Gobekli Tepe pillars.
I was just going to go there. Yes, I was just going to go there.
Another way of representing the concept of a sanctuary where the non-material material come together is represented as an embrace. And that's what we see represented with the two arms, the amorphous arms that come out of the sides of the pillar and wrap down around the end of the pillar. It took me a long time to realize someone was trying to represent artistically the concept of a warm embrace, a familial embrace with those cold carved arms and hands.
Now, what do you make of the purses? I mean, we have the purses just about. I mean, those purses are nearly transoceanic, right? I mean, they're everywhere. They're Sumerian relief text too, as well. We see them on every continent.
Two perspectives. I can give you two perspectives on those purses. One of the traditional descriptions, alternate descriptions of the symbolic cosmology is to refer to it as the basket cosmology. The Dogon talk about it that way. The Buddhists talk about it that way. So a basket becomes a symbol for knowledge. In ancient Egypt, the earliest portable sanctuaries called Seh, S-E-H, were configured that way, like out of bamboo. So they had a curved top and a more squared bottom, shaped just like those handbags. Now you go to the Maori tradition in New Zealand many millennia later, and there's a myth that survives. One of the departmental gods named Tane ascends to the gods and returns with 3 baskets of knowledge. These are baskets, and they're symbolic of the idea of instructed knowledge.
Okay, that's fine. I'm going more literal. I think there's something else. I think it's a nuclear suitcase.
It could be. I mean, it certainly does look like a tool, and what's described as a pomegranate in the other hand of figures that are carved holding the baskets certainly is being held in a way that looks like it's being utilized as a tool. So far, the only toeholds I have into the symbolism come from the cosmological perspective, where it represents, it's symbolic of the concept of knowledge or gathering of knowledge.
And again, let's go in another direction. I literally see like a briefcase, a diplomat with his show notes,
Right.
Information, the stuff that he's taking with him from place to place. And again, I'm just saying, looking at it literally, we can figure out a symbolist way of looking at it for sure. There are. But when each culture has got one of their leaders holding the exact, not even,
right.
It's the exact same object.
Right. I agree completely. One of the restrictions that I end up working under, the biggest threat to my work is that I'll end up chasing off after something that looks like a resemblance to me that actually isn't anything. The human brain is wired to see patterns, whether they exist really or in reality or not. And so to protect myself from doing that, I make the rule for myself that if a culture doesn't represent a thing to be true, I can't represent it to be true. And so I have to work from what each of the cultures I'm studying flatly states, and what they're representing these shapes as being is essentially baskets, or represented there. It's more essentially it's another way of representing the non-material and the material coming together, which again comes down to a concept of transmission of knowledge.
And it could be a briefcase full of knowledge.
It could be. I can't say that it couldn't be.
That goes all the way back to Atlantis.
Right.
Okay. Let's get to Tess. And before we do, why? I mean, you're a seeker of knowledge for sure, but what made you go and see a presentation on exoplanets and Tess's mission?
Well, that whole subject of exoplanets has direct bearing on the Velikovsky material I've worked on. Mm-hmm. And so anytime there's a new announcement, or I have access to somebody who has direct knowledge of what they're doing with the exoplanets, I want to hear it, because it's quite likely to turn up something that has bearing on what I've already written about.
Right. And if we look at, as we discussed earlier, science is nothing but a series of corrections. Right. That's all it is. It's a series of corrections.
That's what it should be. Yeah.
Yep. And if we go back and we start to look at how far we have come since 1923, because in 1923, there was no universe as we know it. It was the Milky Way, and that was it, right? And there was a lot of evidence back then to support that idea, and I get that. But by 1924, the world was tipped over with the new Mount Wilson telescope. Suddenly we're looking at Andromeda. The universe is expanding at a faster rate, and there are galaxies out there outside of the Milky Way. That was just 1924.
Yeah, and it wasn't not even 100 years ago.
It's a lifetime ago. That's it, one lifetime. But back then, still, that Earth was it. No matter what they were discovering out there, planets were the rare thing. They honestly felt that we could quite possibly be it, and that was it. Stars were stars and so forth. How far we have come, not only since then, but how far we have come in the last 20 years. Because 20 years ago, we discovered our first exoplanet. That was just 20 years ago. Yep. And now I think that the most exciting gig out there wouldn't be being an Egyptologist. It would be an astronomer. What a great gig today, because if you go to work, you're going to find an exoplanet tonight.
That's right. No, it seems like a really interesting field to be in.
And when we start to take a look at this, where our Milky Way now, forgetting about the universe, but our Milky Way, now the number is approaching 500 billion stars, 500 billion, where it was 50 billion, it was 10 billion, not that long ago, right?
You're right.
Right? And now we're looking at 500 billion, and the strong suggestion today from the smartest physicists out there that are doing presentations on this is that the next count of planets in our Milky Way is 1 trillion. 1 trillion planets.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that's crazy town. And when you take the math, Laird, and you throw that into our universe and how many galaxies that are out there, which we don't even know now because they're disappearing faster than we can find them. And each one of those galaxies has 500 billion stars, and each one has possibly 1 trillion planets. The numbers now are completely out of control, where none of this was knowledge just 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Right. And honestly, that's the kind of perspective that the Dogons say their ancient teachers were trying to encourage us to discover. They wanted us to understand our true position in relation to the larger processes of cosmology, of creation, because I think their conviction was that if we understood what our real position was in relation to that we would make a different set of choices for ourselves than thinking that we were the be-all and end-all of creation.
Do you think that it has shifted from the possibility of life other than on Earth to how much life is out there?
Absolutely. I think that the potential for life is built right into the structure, as is the potential for consciousness. And that any place where the conditions are right, just as, on our planet, any place where the conditions are even remotely right, we find weeds growing. Any place we go in the universe where the conditions are remotely right, we're going to find life.
Yeah, we can't stop it.
Right.
That's the thing. Life is inevitable. It's something that cannot be stopped. No matter what, we've gone through the most disastrous, craziest events on this planet, right? Mass extermination events. The next day, life.
Right. Yep. You're right.
Going back to the Dogons and the possibility of contact and civilizations other than our own knowing where we are, how to get here, and studying us, I think that is just I think that's just accepted. But the Dogon had knowledge of which you have spoken about, knowledge of things. Forget about celestial bodies, but they had knowledge of the quantum, of the very, very small. Surely an impossibility if we just take it at face value that the Dogon were just a tribe in the middle of Africa, that they shouldn't have known anything.
Right. Well, they're saying that this wasn't knowledge that they themselves developed. They learned this from somebody who understood it. It wasn't given as theory. It was given as, here's how things work. Don't forget it. Well, and so the Dogon, to the job of Dogon society is to preserve that in original form.
How can a quantum, which for everybody out there, I mean, quantum wasn't even a field of study until Albert Einstein started to break this down.
Right.
And quantum theory, quantum mechanics, again, this is a lifetime ago. That's it. We're talking about 100 years of study.
Right.
But the Dogon had a grasp on this, represented this in their symbolism, and that's crazy. It doesn't make any sense, does it? That they would have knowledge of atoms and photons and electrons, stuff that didn't even get discussed until 1905.
Right. And but it's presented in such an intuitively believable way that it's very testable. Also, one thing we have to understand coming into it is that the ancient creation tradition is not above fibbing to us. And I'll give you some examples.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
The Dogon say publicly that their celebration of Sirius, which is the stars, the stars of Sirius, happens every 60 years. It's called the Sigi Festival. But in fact, what happens, according to the French anthropologists, is that after 50 years has passed, the Dogon priests find some pretext to, quote unquote, make an exception this one time and celebrate, hold the celebration after 50 years instead of after 60. And because none of the Dogon tribes people live long enough on average to detect, to see two of these, very few people do, nobody ever discovers the deception. It's a fib they make. Well, another of these fibs, these little fibs that the tradition makes, is the representation that those fundamental concepts of creation are unknowable. This is what public Buddhism does. Public Buddhism, like every religion you've ever heard of, says, well, you're never going to understand this stuff because it's fundamentally unknowable. Humans can't grasp it. Don't try to, because you'll just never understand it. It's beyond our capability. You get to esoteric Buddhism, which is the private Buddhism, and they admit, oh, well, we fibbed about that. Actually, as it turns out, there are a handful of dynamics of energy that are perfectly understandable, on which all the structures are based, and they play out in similar form on the quantum level and on every scale upward from the quantum level. If you understand, and what the Dogon encourages us to do is to look at the processes that we can observe as a way of understanding the processes we can't, because the processes are parallel. So if we understand what the relationship of the two Sirius stars are to each other, we understand what the relationship of the dynamics of two virtual particles is.
And you discussed this. Let's stay right there for a second, Laird. You had an amazing conversation with John Anthony West, and I can't remember what documentary or where this was presented, but you and John asked you about the best symbolism that you can present of the Dogon understanding the quantum. And do you remember that conversation with Jaws? And can you recount that?
That probably came from the Magical Egypt documentary series. Episode 8 is me and John.
Right.
In fact, that was the day I first met John. He didn't tell me in advance that he was going to film it.
Okay.
So I walk into his apartment. My wife, Risa, and I walk in, and there's Chance Gardner from Magical Egypt with a camera, and John Anthony West. We meet, and we sit down, and we start talking, and the whole thing's filmed. So, yes, there are a couple of highly intuitive images the Dogon have that should convince anyone that they know what they're talking about when it comes to science. This goes along with a Buddhist concept of what's called the adequate symbol. These are symbols that inherently can't lose their meaning because they represent something in nature that once you see the shape, you understand what they're talking about. One of those representations is they talk about effectively how electrons relate to atoms. And the drawing they use to represent that is one of the classic shapes of an electron orbital shape. They can image it with using electron microscopes. We know exactly what it looks like, and the Dogon draw it properly. So that's one. The second one is the way they represent concept of fundamental particles. Stephen Hawking says that there are more than 200 fundamental particles in nature. The Dogon say there are 266. Now, both the scientists and the Dogon classify these particles into 4 groupings, and they do it on the same basis. They do it based on the symmetry of the kind of particle. There's some particles, one class of particles that look the same from all 4 sides, like if you were looking at a globe or a rubber ball, it looks the same from every side.
Right.
Another class of particle that has to be turned around halfway to look the same, like a double-sided arrow. There's another kind of particle that has to be turned all the way around to look the same, like a single-pointed arrow. And there's a 4th, very mysterious class of particles that has to be turned around twice to look the same. And that 4th class of particle is that's the kind of symmetry that electrons and protons have. This is the particle that has the potential to be moving into and out of a blind spot for scientists. That one perspective on why we have to turn it around twice is because it, as I say, moves into a blind area and then out of that blind area, but looks to us like we're turning it around twice.
Okay, I want the audience to understand that what we are discussing right now is fresh knowledge and research. This isn't hundreds of years old. All of the revelations, especially when it comes on the atomic scale and what goes on inside of an atom or a photon or an electron and these different particles, this is all in the 20th century. This is brand new, and there is no way. Well, I mean, there is a way, but there's no way that the Dogon or anybody else before 1900 would have a grasp on any of these concepts.
Right. In the traditional view, there is no way that any ancient society, without great help from somebody who knew a lot more than they did, could understand this stuff. Now, one key question I asked myself a couple of years back, it occurred to me to ask, is there geometry that represents that fourth category of particle? That fourth category class of particles is called the half-spin particle.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, is there a geometric representation of that kind of particle? And so I did some research, and I discovered there is. The geometry that represents it is the very same geometry that's the base plan of a Buddhist stupa. It's the very same geometry that modern scientists use to represent how time works. This is significant stuff. In other words, the very first exercise that a Buddhist initiate learns is to lay out this geometry of how to align a Buddhist stupa. That geometry directly points us to the concept of these half-spin particles. And more than that, the Buddhists say that it illustrates how space emerges. And what they don't say to us, but when you get farther into studying it, you realize, is it also represents what the relationship of linear time in the material universe is to nonlinear time in the non-material universe.
Right. Which wasn't, again, discussed until Einstein.
Well, actually, there aren't very many traditional viewpoints on nonlinear time. Einstein sort of, as a toss-off, considered time to be the fourth dimension.
That's right.
But all of the concepts play out so much more easily if you postulate that time is the first dimension. If you say time is the fourth dimension, then a geometric point has no dimensionality to it. If you make time the first dimension, a geometric point has one dimension to it.
There's one thing, aside from who built the Great Pyramid or jump in a time capsule or time machine and go to any point and go see something, I would like to see that and figure out how that was done. There's other things too. Gobekli Tepe would be great. But, there's one basic question that science isn't anywhere near to answering, and that's how a particle without a brain, without a conscience that we know of, right, how particles assemble to the point where you and I can have a discussion about those particles.
Right. How consciousness emerges.
How does that happen?
Well, it's according to the Dogon, all of that is parallel to how material creation happens. Understand one, and you'll understand the other.
Well, yeah. Look, I'm holding up a crystal skull to the camera. Okay, these are the same frigging particles that is talking into this microphone.
Right. Yeah, just arranged a little differently. We need to figure that out. I don't know if physics. I don't know if science ever will. Do you? I don't know. All of these fundamental concepts, these root concepts of how energy works, ended up being the subject of a book I self-published last year called Seeking the Primordial.
Yes.
Now, a more refined view of how the energy works plays out in relation to the elephant god Ganesha, which is a book I self-published a few months ago, a book called Ganesha, The Scientific Symbolism of a Hindu God. That's where the core discussion of all these root dynamics happens in my series of books. The other books lay the foundation for how you can look at it this way, why you should look at it this way. It all gets pulled together in those last two self-published books.
You know, all of your books, and I have so many of them now, but all of your books need to be read. China's cosmological prehistory, that is something that people need to go and read. The origins of myth and symbol. These are necessary readings, and I suggest everybody just go to the links over at jimmychurchradio.com. And it'll take you straight to Inner Traditions and Laird's page there. Laird,
do you have one more second?
Yeah, I was going to say, where can everybody go and find you?
Okay, well, I'm personally, if they want to find me, best place to find me is on Facebook. Friend me and message me on Facebook. And I'm happy to have a conversation with somebody, answer questions, or research symbols, or do whatever. I'm quite often doing favors for people through Facebook message or through email.
Okay.
As far as my books go, you can find them at my publisher's site, innertraditions.com, or their parent company, simonandschuster.com, or you can find them on Amazon anywhere. If you walk into a Barnes & Noble bookstore, chances are one or more of my books is on the shelf. Any of the books can be ordered through any bookstore.
Are you speaking anywhere?
Let's see. At the moment, I don't have any conference engagements scheduled. I was just in Denver speaking in May at what's called LeakCon. It's sort of a conspiracy theory focused conference. Very interesting conference we went to. I was also in Denver a year ago for Gaia TV, did a segment there. I fairly routinely speak at conferences, Fringe, New Jersey, or speaking to the ARE and in Virginia Beach. I've been to Sedona. I've been to the CPAC conferences in California. I've been to Minneapolis to the Paradigm Symposiums. I've spoken in England at a couple of conferences. So just by invitation, I'll speak where I'm invited to come.
Give my best to Risa. And thank you so much. Great conversation tonight, Laird. And I look forward to having you on the show again very soon. And,
great. Thank you very much. I'm so glad you're feeling better.
Yeah, maybe we should drag you to Gobekli Tepe next year in Armenia. So
that'd be great.
That's what I'm talking about. Thank you so much, Laird. Enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Laird Scranton. And the links for all of Laird's books are right there at jimmychurchradio.com. Just click on it and head straight over. I want to remind everybody what's going on for the rest of the week. Tomorrow night, right here, Freddie Silva. Thursday night, Francisco Osa is going to be here as life coach, first time on the show. And then Thursday night, we are doing just extraordinary, The Seating, with director Joe Semple and writer Jack Roth. This is Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. What a great way to kick off this week. Amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Laird. Fade to Black's executive producer is Rita Camarion. Show is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee, Dennis, and Bob. Announcers are Steve Harder, Gene Vito, and Mark D. Kovar. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy. SpaceboyMusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network, and syndication is KGRA, The Planet. This broadcast owned and copyrighted 2019 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black or the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tomorrow night, right here, Freddie Silva. Follow me on Twitter at JChurchRadio. Until tomorrow night, everybody be safe. Gobekli Tepe.